So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today, we are really glad to have with us Camille Schmoll. So I will first present Camille briefly the topic today, and we will give her the floor. So Camille Schmoll is a professor at the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences at EHESS in Paris, and a member of Institut Convergences Migrations. Her work focuses on migration practices and migration policies in Europe and the Mediterranean region, which will be the focus of her speech today. Inspired by feminist geography, she's interested in women in international migration and the gender dynamics related to migration. As a geographer, she explores the relationship between migration and the transformation of Mediterranean spaces and places. You are, Camille, co-responsible of the project Ville Move, Cities on the Move, Mobilities and Socio-Spatial Transformation in the Mediterranean Urban Spaces. You have organized workshops and fieldworks in several cities in both sides of the Mediterranean. But today you are going to give a lecture on women and border in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean region is indeed at the core of your research since the beginning, if I may say, at least since your PhD research that focused on the case of Napoli in Italy, highlighting that far from being a transit space in the journey of immigrants going to the northern countries, Napoli is a place of plural practices of circulation with the establishment of a transnational business with other spaces in Europe and the Mediterranean, such as Algeria, for instance. More recently, you published a book that maybe you will talk about it more after, Women and Migration in the Mediterranean, the Wretched of the Sea. The title obviously refers to the Wretched of the Earth, the famous anti-colonial manifesto written by Frantz Fanon at the height of the liberation war in Algeria and published shortly after his untimely death in 1961. With your book, you make a double displacement from the land our gaze is invited to move on the sea, on the Mediterranean, while at the center of the analysis are women, because this is one of your central arguments, the female faces are missing. Beyond the cliché, where migrant women are usually presented as helpless subjects, as well as victims portrayed in the moment of pain and loss, on the contrary, you highlight the individual trajectories of this woman, such as the life of Julienne, who opens somehow your book without succumbing to Bourdieu's biographical illusion, as you wrote. The singularity of each journey and the plurality also, and the common sense of the plurality of migration, such as the experience of the border. You highlight how this border is not a line, it is a complex space that exists and moves from the departure to the locations of arrival where their life continue. So your work is truly rich, a rich contribution to the academic literature that is on the intersection of border, gender, migration, mobilizing political feminist theories and intersectionality. As we are in Barcelona also, I take the opportunity to highlight the work of our colleague Lorenzo Gabrielli from Grittim UPF, who works on the border spectacle in contemporary photographic representations of the Melilla border, highlighting how the gender bias and the invisibilization of women is part of the production of a securitarian narrative of the border. So, dear Camille, we are happy to have you as a lecturer today. So, floor is yours.
Thank you for such a kind introduction, and actually you said everything, so we can go and no, I will say a few more words, but yes, I'm really grateful to be there, and thanks a lot to the Institute, to the team of the Institute for the invitation, to you, Rafik, and to Ricard, who is not there but invited me. I will talk about my recent research. I will draw on my book, actually, The Wretched of the Sea. It's based on a research I've been undertaking in the central Mediterranean, as you know this expression from Frontex. It's a research I've been conducting for 10 years or so, between the end of the 2000 to 2018, 2019. And as you already know, I guess, so it's a very small introduction to the central Mediterranean, but I guess you already know that. It's actually a very important migration route, and it's also the deadliest one, with more than 25,000 deaths, at least, in the last 10 years. So the background of what I will present is my research for the book, but I will try also, I would like to engage a discussion with you about borders, borderization processes in the Mediterranean, and also what are the implications of looking at migration using the inputs of feminist research, in particular feminist ethnography and feminist critical geography, and to understand contemporary migration and borderization. How do we learn something by what I call feminizing our gaze on migration issues and bordering processes? And why do we still need to research on women? You know, it's a strong debate within gender studies, like, shall we still do some women studies stuff and so on? And I am part of the team for women also, continue to learn and to study women. So the book was published in French in 2020, and it's been translated, so it's also translated in Spanish. Yes, it's easy to find online, actually. You don't have to not in Spanish, but you don't have to buy it. So the starting point of the book is the invisibility of women in the current images we have of Mediterranean crossings. So I started from the media images. So this is the kind of image you find when you look on Google Images or on the newspapers and so on. You always get a very masculine image of the Mediterranean crossing. And so my research began with this observation, trying to understand why we had such a masculine image of Mediterranean crossing, and why the role and the voice of women remain completely unseen and unheard in media representation, but also in most of the scientific accounts of the Mediterranean migration. So that was my starting point, let's say. And to be honest, it's not completely true. Like when you look at representations of migration, some women, female migration, are visible. So it's a bit specific to this kind of crossings, this kind of irregular migration, as it was called by Frontex. Now it's illegal, as you may know. If you look at other pictures, other images representing migration, as you will see, this is a cover of a famous Italian weekly magazine. It's not always the case. You have some representations of migration that are highly individualized and gender balanced. So this is the representation of the new Italian migration, you know, from Southern Europe. You have, since the end of the 2000s, you have a new wave of emigration from Italy in particular, but not only, from Spain and Greece and so on. And so in Nuovi Emigranti, you can see that these are really individualized and very balanced in terms of gender. So why do we have this representation of Mediterranean crossing as a kind of, you know, mass migration, very masculinized, and somehow you can't find the individuals in this representation. No? So I start from this and try to understand why can't we distinguish individualities in these representations, why do we see only the crowd and the masculine crowd? And, well, we can make different hypotheses, of course, about this. The first one is that we could make the hypothesis that there are no women on these boats. Actually, it's not true. And we know from the few statistics we have, when we have, for instance, some data from the NGOs, that from 15 to 20%, depending on the routes, depending on the periods, of the passengers are women. So one of the explanations is that probably when you want to give an image of this Mediterranean crossing, if you focus on the male presence, you can give also something more threatening. So this is an explanation a little bit complotist, but somehow it can be a way to explain. But also, of course, as you can see here, women are really invisible. And there are several reasons for explaining why women are invisible, but one of the reasons, for instance, is connected with gender. The fact that women are many often occupying the central part of the boat. And so when you take a picture, many often you don't see them. And as a matter of fact, the central part of the boat is also the more dangerous, because you are exposed, to the oil and the toxic fuels, and that cause burns. So it's also a matter of gender. What I want to say from here is that everything actually, in what I will tell you about today, and is a matter, many things are a matter intersectional, of course, and are a matter of gender. So starting with these two images, we can already start talking about intersectionality. The way we represent different types of migration is highly intersectional. It's racialized, it's gendered, and it's, of course, classed, as you may see. And, well, we could talk a lot about these pictures because it's also this one is a kind of play with the old images of the old Italian migrants, trying to look at, to show also a form of continuity, but it's not that convincing, actually. So I started with invisibilization of women in the current image media, let's say, or political image of migration along the Mediterranean route. But I have to say that I'm not completely also happy with the image of women within scientific accounts of migration. So this is my second point as an introduction. Many often, women in migration literature are stereotyped figures. Feminization of migration is many often depicted as a recent phenomenon, which is not. So there are also many issues with the representation of women in migration scholarship. Actually, since the 70s, feminist scholars have been acknowledging for the presence of women within migration flows and dynamics. And you probably know this famous article by Mirjana Morgvagic in 1984. Birds of passage are also women. And this paper was advocating for a better recognition of the role of women in international migration. So the 70s, the 80s was the first moment, the first phase of, from a feminist perspective, the claim for a better recognition of the share of women in migration scholarship. And then you have different periods, different moments. You have also different scientific papers referring to these different moments. So you have, for instance, you have a recent paper by historian Nancy Green, referring to 4 different moments in migration scholarship. I used to say there are 3, but this is no importance. So I would say that in the 70s and the 80s, this is the first moment of recognition of the share of women. And then you have a second moment in the 1990s and the 2000s, which is also very much connected with the literature on transnationalism and globalization. So you have many feminist scholars writing about women in international migration, referring to the international division of labor, to inequalities and globalization, showing also how transnational connections and transnationalism are stratified in terms of gender also, internally stratified. And you have a very good paper at the beginning of the 2000s by Brenda Yehu and Geraldine Pratt, referring to the fact that transnationalism that have been depicted usually as something rather positive, actually for women may be a trap also, because it's also being caught within transnational processes is also a very big, maybe a very big constraints in terms of reproductive duties and so on. So, so that was the second moment of acknowledging the role of women in migration. And to tell it very briefly, the third moment for me would be an acknowledgement of the diversity of the figures of female migration. So in the last 10 to 20 years, literature has been, for instance, acknowledging the role of skilled migration and the role of women within dynamic of skilled and highly skilled migration, but also women, female refugees, and the role of the share and the role of women as refugees. So as for now, there is a huge literature, and I think this literature helps us not to look at female migration as a unique and very, very easy to describe phenomena, but rather to describe women. I like this quote from Gillian Rose, a geographer, as social subjects without referring to the figure of woman. So the diversity of the figures of women and women migrants. Another stereotype I already told you about very briefly before is about the idea that this feminization of migration would be new. And you still find this idea in many important books on migration. For instance, The Age of Migration, which you may know, this is an important handbook. You still have this idea of a recent trend of feminization of migration. But when you look at the work of historians, they explain very clearly that there have always been women in international migration, and there have always been women moving, let's say, on their own. We could discuss this expression. I don't have the right words to say that. But another stereotype you find in some handbooks is that autonomous migration is very new, very recent. It's connected to the tertiary society, like, you know, we need more caregivers and so on, so women will move on their own. But actually, women have always been moving on their own. So it's not new. There is no feminization. And if you look at the beginning of the 20th century in France, for instance, or if you look at the period between the two World Wars, you will find many women and much more than men in specific years moving. So it's not at all a new phenomenon. So what do geographers do in this? So we look at where things happen, so the location, basically, the sites, but also the landscapes. And so I borrow from Nira Yuval Davis the expression of situated intersectionality in my book, because I like to situate things. So intersectionality is something. Borders are places, for instance, are sites in which intersectionality happens, and we can use it as a lens to look at the way power relations are reshaped. So we look at where, and then I use in my research I use a feminist geographer approach, so that it looking at places as nexus of power relation, investigating the spatial dimension also of women agency, and not only victimhood. We could come back to that afterwards. Try to look at the nested scales of power, so the way migrant women trajectories and situations are embedded in different scales, from the micro to the macro, but also looking, as a feminist political geography claims, looking at the everyday life, at the trivial things of everyday life, and the way these things of everyday life, so the routines, the routines of everyday life, tells you about power relation. There is an important strand of literature within feminist political geography, which is called the global intimate. And this is what I try to do also, to look at how the intimacy and also intimacy as a relation, from a relation point of view, tells you a lot about the global forces that shape also migration trajectories. It's also an attention for materialities of migration. So now I will talk about a little bit more about my research, my results, and so on. And you will see that I look at the places, but also at the objects, for instance, the artifacts of everyday life. So it can be clothes, hairpin. It can be other objects that I will tell you about. Especially, I will tell you about women underwear, actually. So this is the way I work. I look at everyday life, and in particular, for this research, I've been looking at everyday life in border sites. So these are a few examples of the kind of places I've been working in. So my research took place essentially in Malta, which is this, you may know, a small state island not far from Sicily, and then in Sicily and southern Italy. And also did some research in Cyprus and Tunisia, but it was rather focused on Sicily and Malta. And the places I'm working in are different kind of places. You have accommodation centers for asylum seekers, but you are also detention facilities. But there are some commonalities between these different places, because of course there are places of constraint, and the landscape actually is rather similar. These places are former military facilities or makeshift camps, or they can be also, how do you say, prefabricated buildings, tents, of course. There are similar landscape, so we can talk, of course, about borderscape, referring to these places and referring to the important work of geographers about borderscapes. I want to show you another picture. This is a picture I have taken from a place I've been researching for a couple of years in Sicily. And it is a picture of a window, and you can see the underwear lying outside, the pink underwear. It's a window of a room I've been sitting in for long moments, for many times. And so it's a window of an accommodation center. And you can see from the picture, you can imagine it's quite remote. It's a remote village of Sicily. And maybe there is something quite sweet about this image, because it's, the sky is nice, and it's a nice place, and you don't see the fences and the walls. There are the fences and the walls, but you can't see them, so it's quite soft, let's say. And it's also a little bit gendered, because you have these women underwear outside, laying outside. But as always with the photographs, there are many things you don't see. So you don't smell, you can't smell, and so if you would be able to smell, you could see how humid is the air in this place. You can't feel the cold, the fact that there is no heating, the fact that the women that live in this place, they have to heat some bottles of water to put in the bed of their kids, because there is no heating. So maybe when looking at this photo, you can feel the remoteness, but you cannot see everything about the atmosphere, let's say, of this border place. So just to give you an idea. And for me, this is a little bit of a metaphor of the gendered border, because how can I say? The feeling I had when researching in these places, and also because I do a lot of collective research. I do research with Rafik knows, because we did also some fieldwork together. But I like to go to the places with other persons and to cross our views. And when I go to these kind of places with researchers that are used to work rather in male spaces, they find it easier. They find it easier, like there is something sweeter about this kind of places. But then when you go into confinement, the everyday experience of confinement in these places, the way the rules that are applied to women are many often also different from the rules that are applied to men, and so it's gendered also. There is a form of forced management, of moral management also of the everyday lives of women in these places, and the intimacy policies are much more stronger and harder towards women than towards men. You can feel that it's not that sweet and soft actually as a place. What I want to say is that border space and borderscapes are also moralscapes, and there is a whole part in my book on moralscapes which are gendered. So this idea, of course, is not mine. It draws on many other research. For instance, Didier Fassin research about the articulation, the connection between the restrictive turn in contemporary migration policy and the moral turn, then moral or humanitarian turn, in his word. The context of this picture is this restrictive humanitarian turn, or nexus, as you prefer. Sorry, I got lost in my slides. And this is a political context. The political context that has been taking place, let's say, first of all, in the last 10 to 15 years. But then, if we want to have a broader view, we can see that it's a longer process. So it's like 40 years of, strengthening, tightening of migration policy in the Mediterranean. And actually, the research has been focusing a lot on the long summer of migration of the last 10 years of migration policy. But as you know already, it's a much longer process. And the Arab Springs, the civil wars at the beginning of the 2010s, 2011s, have been just intensifying, have been an occasion to intensify this moment of control, to strengthen the political control of migration. But of course, it's not a new phenomenon. And it's gendered. And now I would like to go back to my former research. So it was my PhD research, and it was in the beginning of the 2000s. And I'd like to do that because just to tell you that things have not always been like that. When I did my PhD research, so I researched the city of Naples in southern Italy, at a border city. Actually, I used to call it a border city. But it was not in the same sense as now we refer to border sites and borderscapes. It was, I was looking actually at the circulation of what we used to call suitcase traders. So people basically buying stuff in Europe and selling the stuff in Northern Africa. There were also in Naples suitcase traders doing this between Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. You also had suitcase traders from other places in Africa, so it was a huge phenomenon. And Naples became a central marketplace within Mediterranean transnational circulations of traders. And when I was doing this fieldwork, I was staying in Naples and I was living in this neighborhood in which people used to trade. And I discovered that there were many women doing this trade. And nobody was talking about that at that time. There were many researchers on transnational trade and suitcase traders, but the role of women was completely invisibilized. So, as I told you before, it's not new that we don't see women. And it was for different reasons that had been interesting to look at, because actually also women, they didn't want to be noticed, because in terms of morals, it was also an issue for them to you know, to go to Italy and other places. And so they had a very particular trajectories in the city, and they will not go into public spaces, of course, and they will not go into cafes and bars and so on. So if you didn't go inside the building where they stayed when they were in Italy, you wouldn't see them. So it took me a while, actually. The map you can see here represent the destinations, the trading destination of a group of women I've been following. These women were originating from the city of Sousse in Tunisia. So you can see that from Sousse, these women will go to all these places in the Mediterranean, and even more, they will go to Thailand, to China for some of them. Yes, they will travel a lot and buy stuff. And I always say that when I see this map, I feel like crying also, because, you know, they would go to some place such as Aleppo and this kind of places where they would go and buy stuff. And now it's just impossible, of course. And they would travel a lot to Europe, and it was okay. So what I want to say is that now this kind of trade still exists, but it's a huge privilege now to be able to trade. And at that time, it was okay. So in 20 years, things have becoming increasingly restrictive and difficult. And this is the kind of stuff, so to talk about underwear still, this is the kind of stuff they would buy in Italy, this kind of women underwear that was produced in Italian industrial districts only for this kind of clientele, because it's very particular and, you know, specific taste, like... And they would sell the things they would buy in Italy on the market, as you can see here, or also in shops or in the place where they lived. And yes, it was a very important phenomenon. It was really a huge one. And it was everywhere. I mean, I followed this group, but it was in every city. You have this group of women trading and going to Italy, to Spain also, for some of them, and so on. The Spanish blanket was very popular, actually. So this is a way to tell you about, starting from women's underwear, it's a way to talk about, actually, this move, no? This historical move from border as a site that you can go through and come back and so on, and you can use as a way to make money. Actually, it was a trans-border trade, and the border, the stickiness of border, as for now, and the way many people now are embedded, are stuck in the border, in the Mediterranean border, and of course, in terms of research strategies. It means that researchers have to have completely different research strategies, because if in the past we were able to follow people, actually to follow the people, so following, you know, the famous article by Marcus, we would follow the people, follow the things, follow the money, follow the plot and everything, and it was quite easy. And actually at that moment, at the beginning of the 2000s, you had many researchers doing also investigations on trans-Saharan migrations. You had, they were a little bit crazy though, but you had those people following, you know, the people crossing the Sahara and so on. You had these researchers. So things have become really different also in terms of research strategies and research practices, of course, because the trajectories are now increasingly violent, increasingly difficult, as you know. It became also dangerous for researchers, so it's difficult for researchers also to move between places and so on. So the very example of this underwear for me is telling about also the way we have to adjust to the context, also in terms of methodologies and in terms of positionalities on the field. I wanted to make another small example about these materialities. If you look at the trivial things of everyday life, to think about borders, to think about the situation of migrants in the Mediterranean. We can also look at other objects, and the other example I wanted to make is the example of cuddly toys. This is also a common feature between all the border sites. Like you have cuddly toys everywhere. I don't know if some of you do research on borders and border sites, but it's really impressive. Like you have, and these pictures have been taken in very different places, border places, but still you have cuddly toys. And so what is interesting about cuddly toys is that it's probably the kind of thing that you are given when you have a baby. You are given many cuddly toys, and so you don't know what to do about it with it, and so you just give them to the migrants or to the associations and the GOs and so on because you don't know what to do with it. And so these places are full of them, and they are yes, they participate to the borderscape. Huh? I come back to the picture of the window. Just to tell you also something about the positionality of researchers and the epistemological context in which we work. So I already said that things are becoming policies are becoming increasingly restrictive. There is this humanitarian restriction, repressive nexus that makes people becoming actually humanitarian subjects. So that's why we talk about a nexus, like people become vulnerable because of restrictive policies. So they are humanitarian subjects because there are those policies. They are not humanitarian subjects necessarily at the beginning of their trajectories. And it's, of course, also it applies to women. But it's also talking about border sites and borderscapes. It's also being located in a very specific moment, epistemological moment. With two colleagues, Thomas Lacroix and Soigny Poto, we have written a paper on the critical turn within migration scholarship. And the idea is to show how this increasing restrictiveness of migration policy has also put migration scholars in a very different situation, with a very different stance compared to the approach that was ours like 20 years ago. So while 20 years ago we were focusing on flows, circulation, transnational processes, even when we were looking at inequalities and so on, and power, but still now we focus on borders, on bordering processes, on humanitarianism, and so on. So things have been changing a lot, and yes, we talk about a critical turn. These are a few examples of the kind of stance we now have in migration scholarship. It's not absolutely not. It's not representative of anything. These are just a few examples. So borders, borderlands, borderscapes, and so on have become central in our vocabulary, and this turn is of course a response to the growing illegalization, criminalization of migration, and so on. I think we can from this, but maybe I will keep it. This part I will keep it for the discussion. But I think we can also critically address this issue, because epistemologically we became more and more critical, but maybe there is something we miss also in becoming so much focused on borders. But we can have maybe we can have this discussion afterwards. Sometimes I use as an example a paper that has been much discussed and also much criticized. That is a paper from Rogers Brubaker, which was issued in 2005, on diaspora talk, because in 2005 the term was transnationalism and diaspora. It was really the big ones in migration scholarship. And so this paper by Brubaker raises the issue of you know, if you start to name everything as a diaspora thing, then you will lose, you know, the meaning of diaspora. So he points at the risk of losing somehow a kind of what he calls a dilution of the concept of diaspora. So he says sometimes diaspora is under-theorized, it's vague, it's kind of metaphor, it's not, it becomes too broad, because if the diasporas are everywhere, they are nowhere, and so on. And maybe we could have a similar reflection of the use, because I gave just a few examples, but there are so many others, of the way we refer now to borders and bordering processes, and the fact that we may lose something by using it as a very broad category, and we may lose something about what's happening. But now I will come back to my own research on women and borders, just to tell you, because I told you that we have to adapt to the situation and to organize as researcher, to have different, actually, the restrictive turn, the humanitarian and restrictive turn is giving us, urges us actually to develop new methodologies, new ways to work with migrants, and we have to search for other ways. This is just an illustration of course, the most evident illustration of this turn is the mortality at the borders. Talking about mortality, the women I've been working with were survivors somehow, like they had to deal with death along their trajectories. They saw the deaths of other people, people also disappearing, and so on. So this is one issue I had to address, like the issue of disappearance and the issue of death. Many of us have to address these issues. How do we address the loss, but also the ghosts of the people that have disappeared, that are also present in everyday life? So this is one of the methodological issues I had to face, which was difficult. And at that time, when I started researching, so this was at the end of the 2000s, there was no writings on this. Now there are some, but there was no writings at the time. So I used literature. I used some fiction, actually, and it was helping me to try to understand what was happening, because nothing at that time was written in terms of research on this. Now, fortunately, things have fortunately or not fortunately, things have a little bit changed. How do we deal with the experience of border spatiality and the experience of the long crossing of the borders? If we think of border crossing as for now as processes that may last years, not months, years, how do we deal with that in terms of research? So as I'm a geographer, my first experience was cartography, but I'm not sure, I will show you, but I'm not sure it's helpful, actually. The idea was to show the lengths, so try to represent the length of the path of, and so drawing on the story of Julienne that is told in my book. I wanted to represent how long it was, how long it took to come to Europe. But I'm not really sure. So how do we represent actually the length of the border experience? How do we talk? How do we talk, or how we represent violence? It's not. I think it's. We still have to think about it. In my experience, the stories of border violence were told very, very often. Actually, I think my presence on the field was an opportunity to talk about violence, because there were not many occasions to talk about violence. And as you may know, the violence you may face en route is not taken into account when you apply for an asylum. So it's not useful somehow, if I may say so, as a form of violence, no? So when I was on my field sites, these issues would be raised, but not necessarily during interviews, but maybe during discussions, informal discussions, sharing experiences of violence. And this is, of course, the importance of being for a long time on the site and sharing informal discussions and not only doing face-to-face interviews that are not always the best way to talk about that. My research was not specifically focused on violence, but violence, as for death, was everywhere. And I had to deal with that because I didn't want to talk necessarily about that, but actually that was the way the issue the women would raise when we talk about their experience. And of course, I was not prepared because my generation was not prepared to deal with this, especially in geography. I have to say, we are not very reflexive. So my intent at the beginning was really to show how border work was a gender work and so on, but they would always come back to the issue of the trajectory, and it is through the experience and the narrative of the trajectory that we will raise the connection between border life, border and gender violence, and this is the way they have. They took me on the. They accompanied me somehow on the issue of bordering and border violence. Another point I wanted to make, talking about gender and women, but I'm too long, is the instrumentalization of gender violence. As you know, agencies, EU agencies and national agencies, they will talk a lot in a context of gender mainstreaming about gender violence and the violence women face on the road and so on. And so there is a strong also trend of instrumentalization of this kind of gender violence. And Lorenzo has been working, Elsa Tisler also has been working on this and so on. So it's a very strong trend. And policymakers, agency in charge of migration policies, they will take gender as an argument, to say it's part of the construction also of women as humanitarian subjects and vulnerable subjects. So in order to prevent women from facing this kind of violence, we will stop them and we will stop migration in the same way. So the way the instrumentalization of gender violence and women became useful to the hardening of migration policies to be a matter of concern for us, of course. And then I wanted to point at the fact that I tried also to look at borders as sites of resistance. So in my research, I talk about autonomy, which can be discussed as a term. I draw, of course, on the literature on autonomy of migration, which you may be familiar with, Sandro Mezzadra and so on, but also on the way feminist scholars use the term autonomy. And I try to point at the way women are able somehow to implement strategies or tactics, in ways in a way that they are able to organize ways to escape somehow for their everyday situation at the border. So this is also a discussion we could have. The issue of autonomy, of course, can be criticized because it's very focused on agency and so on, and talking about agency when referring to border situations may be criticized, of course. But for me, it was a way to understand, because it's still a puzzle for me, how people stuck in such difficult situation, and especially women when it comes to my research, are able to organize, to continue to rely on specific resources such as solidarities and so on to go on with their trajectories. So just to finish, to conclude, In my research, I oppose a feminization of migration, which is something that does not exist, as I told you before. No feminization of migration. Migration has always been women, and it's not new. With the idea of feminizing the gaze, the idea that we can draw on the resources, on the objects, on the approaches that are suggested by looking at women's everyday life to give a different account, a richer account actually of migration. So the idea of feminizing our gaze is to be attentive to the complexity, the multiplicity of the aspects of the migratory phenomenon and its connections with different contexts, both also domestic, non-domestic, public, private, and so on, between here and there, and to provide a more complete view of migration. And it's a matter of recognition, and it's a way to destabilize the masculine view of migration and to give another version of the migratory experience, a version that is situated, incorporated, that makes emotions, that's why I gave you these quotes, emotions a central aspect of the migration trajectory, but also looking at the physical subjectivity of the migratory path. And so looking, for instance, at the embodied dimension of bordering, and so the body as a site, of course, for the government of migration, but also a site of resistance. And in my research, I look at the use migrant women make, for instance, of the digital space as the way to represent their trajectory, to represent by also using bodily techniques to represent themselves and to represent their path. And the way the digital space is also, so internet, social networks, and so on, is also an observatory for us of the autonomy of migration. Feminizing the gaze, for me, is also looking at the migration as a relational experience. So it's a way to deconstruct the opposition between individual migrations on one hand, and you would find, for instance, categories such as single women, and you would think, okay, it's an individual migration, and on the other side, women with children. And actually, migration is always a relational experience, and sometimes we forget a little bit about it. So feminist scholarship, of course, raises the issue of relationality and interdependency. And so care, protection, solidarity, and so on are very important in the migration experience. Looking at new scales, new spaces, such as spaces of intimacy or spaces of non-intimacy, because many of these spaces are not really intimate. So intimacy as an issue of power, and then overcoming the opposition between migrant women as heroine or migrant women or migrant subjects, because it's only men, but also men, as victims. So overcoming this issue of migration, seeing migration as something heroic somehow, a heroic path, seeing migration as a path to emancipation, which is not true actually, but not only seeing women as victims also, and rejecting this cliched opposition between victims and heroines, you know. So maybe I can stop with this design that have been made by children actually who have in French schools who have been working on the story of Julienne with one of the person I've met many times, and I talk about in my research, and I showed you the map before. And I think it's much more actually interesting and complex than maps, because you can see that, for instance, they raise all the obstacles, they show all the obstacles that Julienne has been facing, but at the same time, Julienne is represented as a superheroine, but at the same time, you can see that the reign starts in Europe. So it's not, the border space and the border trajectory is a long one. It does not stop with the crossing of the Mediterranean, actually. You can see that between Libya and Italy, the reign starts. So somehow I find it more complex and interesting than the way I would on my geographer, with my geographer, skills, represent things about these trajectories. And thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Camille. Thank you for your lecture. It was really inspiring, and if I remember well, also the book won the award for the best book for, I think, high students in high school, right? In geography, right? So well, thank you so much for this lecture. So I think that we can move for the session for questions. If you have any question, because I think that the lecture raised a lot of dynamics. So actually, I think that Elisabetta probably has the mic. So if you want to ask any question, please go ahead.
And also talk about your own research, which would be interesting for me.
As well. The first question is still, Emilia. No, we need it because we are registering.
Registered.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting, and it's a new, well, not a new scope, but a scope we sometimes forget. So thank you very much. My question was regarding the methodology. Like, how did you manage to approach women, especially in these intimate centers, like in these intimate spaces? And have this confidence relationship in order to collect data and conduct your research.
Thank you. So, as I said, I've been trained in the 1990s and 2000 to multi-site ethnography. So I used to move and follow the people, and then people started to be stuck in border sites. Well, it's a bit caricatural what I'm saying, but let's say so. And so at that point, we had to change. I had to change to rethink my way of doing research. So what I was doing is trying to access these sites, which is not always easy because some of these sites are closed, and especially detention facilities, of course, and you have to get some access, some authorization. It's not always easy. So it's a difficulty, and also what is important also about border sites that they change very often. Like, you would find a space, for instance, in Malta there was this big hangar, which was a former military hangar, and at the end of the 2000s it was an accommodation center for single men, and then 1 year after, it was for families coming from the war in Libya and so on. So also things change very quickly, and I'm doing very slow research because I teach in Paris and I have kids, and so I go when I have time. So it's very slow. That's why it took me 10 years. And so what is interesting when you do slow research is that you can see with the time you can see things changing, but at the same time, once you get the authorization, you can stay for a couple of weeks, and after the government has changed and you don't have anymore the authorization because they don't want anymore you to see what's happening in these facilities and so on. So that's a difficulty. But fortunately enough, I could access several places, come back again. When I don't have access anymore, I meet with the people outside when they can get out, or I keep in touch through social networks and telephone. So that's the way I worked. These places are really places of boredom. So it's a bit maybe opportunistic, but for scholars, for researchers, there are places in which people have nothing to do. So they are more than happy to meet and discuss about their experiences and spend some time with you, because they are really, really bored. And women, maybe to some extent even more than men, because as far as I understood, they have less access to the labor market. For instance, I had the opportunity also to visit and to spend some time in men facilities, and you could see that there were some connections with, for instance, agricultural work or this kind of things, and for women it was even more difficult. So they would really be and also because sometimes they have to take care of their kids. So they will, you share the time and the space, and you stay there and you do ethnography as we always do, like you stay there and you take care of the kids when they have to get out. So you try to be helpful somehow, and you accompany them because I had a car when they have to do some shopping or they have to go to the doctor, and so on. So this is the way I work, but it's really a traditional way of doing ethnography, to the exception that, of course, the objective of this person is to move. So sometimes they will leave, fortunately. They will stay for a long period in these places, but they will leave. And so I follow them then. I try to meet them where they are, or I continue to exchange via the social networks or the telephone, WhatsApp and so on. Yes, so I do also a little bit of online ethnography, but it's just, I just engage with people I've met before. I don't do just pure, online stuff. It's really a relation between on-site and online. And yes, that's it.
Thank you. So we can take another question. Yeah, there. Al fondo. Non, en catalan.
Tu me fais la translation simultanée.
En el seu llibre parlava una mica del tema de la corporalitat, no? Del cos de les dones en la immigració, i a mi m'agradaria que em pugui donar una mica més d'explicació sobre aquest tema, perquè m'interessa molt com el cos, no? De les dones migrants, no? A vegades es pot utilitzar com un cos de resistència, com es transforma en tot el procés de la immigració.
Ok, la corporalité. Je pense que j'ai compris. It was about the corporality of migration.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So yes, the first thing is, the first aspect is the way border policies are embodied. So the embodied border and the way bodies become part of, become the target of migration policies. So this is a subject that has been studied by many scholars actually, and it is gendered. So the way, for instance, the sexual and reproductive health of women becomes the target of border policies is a way to look at this. And what was really interesting for me, for instance, is to look at some of the women I met were pregnant, and their pregnancy resulted many often from the rape. They have been raped along their trajectory, often in Libya or when crossing borders and so on. And so the issue of pregnancy and the way you deal with a pregnancy that is a consequence of a rape, and the way it was discussed in the accommodation facilities was really somehow fascinating for me, because at the beginning I was I don't want to make general assumption, but it's true that many of the women I met, they wanted to keep the baby. And this issue of keeping the baby was not understandable for the people working in the accommodation centers. It was really a very strong controversy, you know, because it's a risk. You are not in very good health conditions. You are not in a very good legal condition and so on. So why would you keep this baby, you know? And sometimes these women were also, they had several health issues. So, but for them, abortion very often was not an option. They wanted to keep the baby, and so there was a lot of tension on this between, you know, the person working in the accommodation center that have also a very ambivalent, there is a lot of research on this also, ambivalent position, because they are between control and help, and it's very ambivalent. And so discussions around this issue of health and reproductive aspects was very important. I tried also to look at the everyday routines, so the way women took care of you know, things like cooking or like religious routines, the way religious routine became really important, you know. The fast, actually, the fasting was something women would do very from different religions and so on. But fast is a way to exert control on your body, and so it's not always religious, actually, fasting, and it's also a way to really to. It was very often like a couple of times I was told, you know, I will fast and things will get better for me, like. So fasting, but also routines such as preparing food together, dancing, singing, and so on were important in everyday life, and they were really a way to gain some power on their, you know, on their fate, on their situation, on their trajectories. They are very small acts of resistance, I guess, to the situation in which they were, because they were stuck. So, yes. So everyday routines and the bodily routines of everyday life were an important aspect. The way you dress, the way you also dyeing your hair, or these kind of things are really important in the everyday lives of women.
Thank you. We have another question.
Hi. So I wanted to ask you, like, what future research direction do you think that it would be crucial to focus on, so we can understand and improve the lives of these women, of these migrant women? Because, I mean, there are like a lot of kind of issues to cover when it comes to migrant women, and covering all of them at the same time, maybe it's not efficient. So in which direction should we focus to improve this?
I do agree. I don't know. I think there are many directions. For instance, when I tried to follow the situation of the women I met, because when I met them, most of them were asking for asylum. And of course, many of them, some of them were granted asylum, but many have been rejected and so on. So they continue on an irregular path. They stay in Europe. Some of them have been sent back, but then they came back and so on. So it's the whole debate about, you know, you're probably familiar also with this debate on demigranticizing, because when do you stop to be a migrant person? And maybe we could ask the same questions about borders, because when I look at the experience of the women I met and I'm still in touch with now, so after 5-10 years I met them, they are still, I could say many of them are still irregular, actually, or they have moments of regularity, and so on. And so you could still say they are caught in the border, actually. They are now in Germany, in France, in other countries, but they are still caught in the border. So when I think we really have to address their situation, not only in terms of border and migration, but I don't know if the term, the right term is post-migration or anything else, but it's the issue of the issue that has been controversed and also rejected by scholars of integration, but I don't have another term. So I tell integration. I know it's not the right term, but you know, what happens afterwards? Because what we know, and we all know that, is that these policies are terrible. They are deadly. They are violent, and so on. But people continue to move, and so yes. What is everyday life when you are in a regular, irregular, this kind of gray situation between regularity and irregularity, and after 5, 10, 15 years being in Europe, what does it mean? And maybe we could, yes, it would be one possible direction. There are many others, and there are many researches going on different aspects of women's experiences, but there are so many things still to look at. If you have ideas or suggestions or
I would probably say the same. Like, I think not only focusing on women, but in general, like the issue of migrants once they are in a stable country, I would say. In this case, once they are in Europe, is not addressed enough, because we tend to think that once they arrive at the European country, they're like everything's fine, like the issue has come to an end. But most of the times, it's where the issue starts. Because, for example, in my case, I was born here, and for example, my parents had the privilege to migrate in an easier legal way. But for example, my mother's brother, he was an illegal migrant when he came, and until now, almost 10 years after, he's still struggling to be to be considered, to have everything done, the papers and everything, and that's something that I don't see addressed enough. Like, yeah, it's easy to go and have discourses, hate discourses about these migrants coming and not, for example, not working or taking the jobs of the people here. But then when it comes to helping them to get that job, that's something that we don't address. So I completely agree with you, because we tend to focus on migration when it's on the Mediterranean, on the way to Europe, but once they're in Europe, no one addresses that, and we just tend to hear these speeches of hate about it, but no one does nothing about it. Yeah.
Thank you. So.
But also, you know, there are fashions in research, so we've been focusing a lot of border and border policies, also because the political context was, and it still makes it very, very more than necessary. And unfortunately, I guess we'll have to engage even more in the future with the political context. But it's also a matter of, you know, research has its own fashions, and things evolve. And yeah.
Maybe there is a question there. Sorry.
Hello.
No, go ahead.
Oh, hi. First of all, thank you for this really interesting talk. I guess on this last point, what do you see as being the next fashion trend in terms of what to expect after maybe the border fades or becomes, what's going to replace the border in terms of this debate? Do you have any idea or any sense as someone who studied this?
No, I have absolutely no idea. I'm waiting for the next trend. will jump on the train. No, I don't know. I don't know. Actually, I think we have been completely, I mean, I don't know if hijacked is a good term, but by the political situation. And it's really difficult to open new space when you have to fight. And we have to fight as a migration scholar somehow. It becomes a bit complicated. Sorry. It's a bit disappointing. But
yeah, there's a point.
Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I thought it was really interesting when you talked about kind of the stereotypes and the misconceptions that academia, but people broadly have about female migrants and their agency and the things that they're able to do to support themselves and their families. You mentioned that you're still in touch with a couple of people that you had interviewed 10, 15 years ago. I'm wondering, during your research project, when you were in border spaces or camps or places where women were trying to figure out what the next step is to support themselves and their families, if there was any kind of like material support or connections you were able to provide to them. Because I feel like sometimes with research, I struggle with the, like, you know, we're quote unquote researching people in really vulnerable situations. What can we do in return? Are there ways to help? And I think sometimes at NGOs, I've experienced the same feeling, like you're witnessing really hard situations, really resilient women, and there's like a, you know, like, do you ever have the feeling of like, how can I help, or like, what can I do, and how do you manage that even 10 years after?
As I said, I was not trained for that because we were really poorly trained in geography on these issues. I mean, of ethics and positionality and so on. We were absolutely not reflexive on this. So it took me some time to think about it. But fortunately enough, I think you are much more trained than we were. It's a matter both of discipline and generation, I guess. Yes, it's really complicated because, of course, you cannot do much. The first thing you can do is, as it's you say in any ethical protocol, to try to do not harm. It's already something, but of course it's not enough. So it's a very difficult issue, and very somehow I guess it's personal in a sense that I mean, each of us has to try to deal with that. So I can tell you I have a mix of things. Like the first thing is that when I meet with people, I tell them that I will probably not be able to do much, and I think it's important to be honest and not to think that you will save the people, because the savior, you know, position is not correct. It's really problematic, and so we have to be honest about the limits of what we can do. What I tell to the person I meet usually is that what I will be able to do is to raise their issues publicly, to try to talk about the problem, the difficulties they face, and the impact somehow of migration policy on their situation, but I will not be able to address it individually. And so it's a way for me to be really honest about the limits of my position. So what I try to do my best especially in France, because I live in France, but you know, to address in the newspapers, in many public situations. I go a lot in debates, I meet with many actors of different kind to address these issues. But of course, it will not help single person. And then, of course, when I can, I try to help single person. I try to organize some connections that may be useful. There are many interesting pieces of research on, for instance, the issue of money. Sometimes you give money, and there is this, I don't remember her name, this anthropologist working on Yemen. She wrote a very good piece on the way, basically she completely ruined herself during the war, now the war in Yemen. She sent a lot of money, and she wrote I will find the reference, and she wrote a very interesting piece on this, because it's also something we never talk about, but you try to help as much as you can, but and sometimes even a lot, but it's always you will not erase the fact that you are in a position of privilege. So it's always very, an equality on the field.
I was just going to say that's really helpful and interesting. Thank you.
Okay, very good.
Thank you so much. So maybe one last question, if you would like. And maybe also related to the, there is a question from Lorenzo, and also he was thinking that this work that you have done with actually the students and in the school, do you think also that it could help? Is it part of your project of? I mean, if you could talk a little bit more about
Yes, I try to meet very often with school students. And so this project was, they read a chapter of the book on the story of Julienne, and they had to draw, and they organized an exhibition. So, I had many experience of this kind of project. And another kind of project was, but it's always, it's not my initiative, it's the initiative of the school teachers. I just go and discuss with the kids and so on. Another initiative was to encourage the students to engage with their own family migration story. And it was really amazing because so it was in a school in Seine-Saint-Denis, which is in France, in northern Paris, and it's a very it's a place that is, in terms of migration history, is really rich. Like it's a more diverse place in France, and some of the girls, they met with their mother, with their aunties, with their grandmas, and they started to tell their story. And they never heard the story of migration. For instance, there was this aunt that said to the girl that she used the passport of another woman and so on, but she never talked about it before. And so sharing these family stories of migration, and it's also a way to de-exceptionalize, also to make it more somehow, it's our common history, the story of migration. We all have somehow a migration history. So it was a very interesting way also to work with the students, sharing their own family stories.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a last, maybe probably a question from Lorenzo. Yeah, there is time, of course.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, about the experience and life experience that you recollect through your fieldwork, how they perceive the time dimension, so the fact they are stuck somewhere, they can control the time of their movement, of their life, but at the same time, if they have some strategies in order to take part of control on their times, some collective strategy or individual ones.
Yes, it's a very good question. I would need to think about it, because there have been a lot of research on the temporalities, as you know very well, on the temporalities of the border, and the way the time is becoming really long and boring when you are stuck at the border. And of course, it's also so. What I was referring to before, like organizing parties, meetings, cooking, and so on, it's also a way, of course, to make something of this time. But I think I would need to think about it a little bit more, because also referring to the situation of these women now after such a long trajectory and still being for some of them undocumented. The issue of time is something that should be studied more, maybe, because I'm thinking of some of these women who have basically, they left their country, their children they left behind. I'm thinking of the children they left behind. They were small kids, and now some of them are on various paths. It's something very interesting, but I haven't thought about it enough. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much. So I think that because we are talking about time, so we should finish this lecture. So thank you so much for being there. And thank you very much, Camille, for this fascinating lecture and super inspiring and super also actual regarding what's happening around the world. So thank you so much and have a nice evening.
Thank you.